As we explore the people, places, and features that create the backdrop for the greatest story ever told, we must beware of unbiblical allegories and let Scripture be our guide. Here's the thing. There's so much we could read into Scripture. In other words, we could open our Old Testaments and we could see Jesus everywhere. And the truth is, He is everywhere. I mean, that's true. The Bible is all about Him. Every verse, every word, I believe that. But we've got to be careful about not getting carried away with that. And so how do we know? Well, we let Scripture be our guide. We're not apostles. We're not authorized to interpret Scripture or to write Scripture. We're charged with proper interpretation of Scripture. So we want to look at what the New Testament or the Old Testament in some cases. Sometimes the prophets will pull up themes from earlier in the Bible and they'll say, this is symbolic of this, or this helps us understand that. Sometimes the New Testament authors will do that. Some of it's right on the surface. You see it right on the surface and you go, okay, yeah, that's a great thing. Sometimes you have to look real carefully at what the New Testament authors are actually saying to see that they're using these things symbolically or allegorically. So that's what we want to limit ourselves to. If not, it can get real crazy. Like I said, we can start seeing allegories everywhere. And one of the most dangerous things you can do with Scripture is start making allegories. Well, this represents this represents that are not based in Scripture. So as we go through, I'm going to bring us up to the edge of that allegorical side, but I'm going to let Scripture be my guide. In other words, the only allegories that I want to point out are the allegories that I see Scripture pointing out about itself. And that will be our guide. So it's huge warning there as we get into this, because it can get kind of crazy if we don't do that. Real quickly, I want to just do an overview of where we're going to go. These are one-sentence overviews. We'll come back and talk about each of these on another level, and we'll try to unpack where in Scripture we get some of these ideas from. So we want to start with the idea of regions and nations. If you can kind of picture what the biblical world looks like, you have Egypt and Israel and the neighbors around Israel and Babylon and Assyria. But some of the main regions and nations that we want to talk about are, first, Eden. That's where the story starts. So we want to think about, what is Eden? Why is Eden in the very second chapter of the Bible? Why do we encounter Eden? And then what is the Garden of Eden's role throughout the rest of Scripture? Now, this is one of those that's not mentioned. You don't see Eden as a name, as a word, coming up over and over again in Scripture, but you do see elements that are in the Garden of Eden coming up over and over again, all the way down to the last chapter of Scripture. So Revelation 22 talks about the tree of life that's for the healing of the nations. Well, we need to understand what's the metaphor and what's the symbolism that Scripture uses for the Garden of Eden. Right here I have it just in kind of summary form. It represents God's presence and fellowship with humanity. Then there's the Promised Land. We know about the Promised Land. We hear about the Promised Land all the time. But we can't think of the Promised Land as only that place that the Jewish people went when Joshua and Moses led them there. It is that, and that's the physical place that it is, but it also represents God's promises to His people. There's a huge connection in Scripture, and so to connect the idea of the Garden of Eden and the Promised Land together, we don't often think of this because we're not reading the book of Genesis headed into the Promised Land. But the word earth and land mean the same thing, it's the same word. And so you think about being given the earth or being given the land, and then you're given a rule, right? Don't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And if you do that, then you stay in the Garden of Eden. If you don't do that, you die and you lose the garden. So if you're a Jewish person headed into the Promised Land and God's given you a covenant, and something that we don't often realize, we'll talk about this when we come to covenants, we don't often realize that the covenant with Israel was, if you will do these things, you get to keep the land. The land is very important. We think of it from a salvific standpoint. We think, well, if they didn't keep all the laws, they didn't get saved. Salvation, the New Testament is clear, is by faith from first to last. It's always been about faith. The Mosaic covenant cannot replace the covenant that God made with Abraham, so salvation is by faith. That covenant that God makes with His people is really about whether they get to keep the land or not, and whether God is going to give them peace in the land. So the Promised Land is a huge picture of God's promises for His people, and what He's going to do for them. Then there's Egypt. Most of us know the story of Egypt. You know, the Jewish people go down to Egypt, they're enslaved there. But that place of Egypt also takes on this idea of spiritual bondage. The New Testament authors pick it up and they talk about the idea of, and it's very subtle. We'll read a passage in just a moment that alludes to it, but it's very subtle, but it's this idea that coming out of Egypt and coming out of bondage to your sin is a metaphorical and symbolic thing. Then there's the wilderness. This is the place where Israel was for 40 years, and they wandered in the wilderness. But think about what happened there. The wilderness cannot support a nation. There are not enough resources there. A nation goes out into the wilderness, they die. But they didn't. Why didn't they die? Manna fell from the sky and fed them. God gave them water from a rock. God provided everything they needed. Remember, their shoes didn't wear out, their clothes didn't wear out. So the wilderness becomes, and it's not just here when they're in the 40 years wandering in the wilderness, it's picked up even in the New Testament. It becomes this symbol for a place where God provides for you miraculously. It's a desolate place, it's a difficult place, but it's a place where God provides for you miraculously. So I want to read to you from 1 Corinthians chapter 10. If you want to turn there and look, I'll give you just a second to get there. And I want you to see this. You're saying, well, Pastor, I think you're getting out there. You're seeing some symbols that aren't there. Again, I want to tie myself to Scripture, and I might cross that line, and if I do, hopefully I'll see it and come back, because there are plenty of people who cross these lines. There are plenty of people who make analogies and allegories that aren't actually there. But Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 that these things, yes, really happened. They're real historical events that happen in real historical places, but they also happen as an example for us. So Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians, and the author of Hebrews tells us in the book of Hebrews, that these things are symbolic of our spiritual journey. So 1 Corinthians chapter 10, he says that, I don't want you to be unaware, brothers, that our fathers were all under the cloud and passed through the sea. That's a reference to the Exodus, to the cloud that led them by day, to their parting of the Red Sea and walking through it. And all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. So see how he connects baptism to that coming through the Red Sea event. Then he says, they all ate the same spiritual food and drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank from the spiritual rock that followed them, and the rock was Christ. Nevertheless, with most of them God was not pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness. Now these things took place as examples for us, that we might not desire evil as they did. Do not be idolaters as some of them were. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. We must not indulge in sexual immorality as some of them did, and so on and so forth. So down to verse 11, again he says, now these things happened to them as an example, but they were written down for our instruction, on whom the end of all ages has come. So Paul says there are some lessons for us to learn, some spiritual lessons for us to learn from the Exodus out of Israel, out of Egypt. Then there are some cities. There are some cities, and there are many cities. I just chose a couple of three that I wanted to highlight, and then two that you can't go without seeing these patterns all throughout Scripture. So the three that I wanted to highlight first are Bethel and Shiloh and Bethlehem. Bethel and Shiloh we don't think much about, but Bethel means house of God, and so it's the place where Jacob saw heaven. He went to sleep and he had a vision of heaven, the angels ascending and descending out of heaven. Well, the New Testament picks up that imagery in regards to the Messiah, but it also, even in the Old Testament, becomes a place. It's the house of God. It's the place where Jacob somehow saw into heaven, and so it becomes a very spiritually symbolic place in the Old Testament. Then there's Shiloh. Shiloh is important because there's a time in which the Ark of the Covenant is there. The tabernacle's there, the Ark is there. When Hannah goes to pray and God blesses her and gives her a child, that all happens at Shiloh. We think about Jerusalem as being the place where the Ark of the Covenant was, and eventually it was there. David moved it from Shiloh to Bethlehem, but there was a time when Shiloh was really the religious center of the nation of Israel. So that's a very important place for us to remember. Bethlehem, obviously, we think of it as the birthplace of Jesus. It means the house of bread. But we can't just think, oh yeah, little town of Bethlehem, comes along there in Matthew, in Luke chapter 2. But But we need to remember that Bethlehem has a history. It's the place where David was born. It's not just the place where Jesus was born. Jesus was born there because David was born there. It was the city of David. And it means house of bread, and there's a connection in the story of Ruth to that idea of it being a house of bread and God's people looking for bread somewhere other than that, although God would have provided for them even in a desolate place. Then there's Babylon or Babel. This is one of the most interesting things you'll see all throughout Scripture, and it is very important for what we're studying on Sunday mornings in Revelation. Babylon is a real city. It starts out as Babel, the Tower of Babel, but it takes on this symbolic meaning as a place of organized rebellion against God. And it's used by the prophets, and it's used in the Old Testament, and it's used in the New Testament in the book of Revelation to symbolize humanity's organized rebellion against God. It's the first place that humanity joined. Now, there have been plenty of rebellion up to that point, but this is the first place when they said, let's do this together. Let's rebel together at this place, and let's do what God has commanded us not to do. And so it becomes this symbol of organized rebellion against God and a symbol of evil. Then Jerusalem and Salem, it's the same city. It's most often referred to as Jerusalem. It's exactly the opposite. It's the city of God. It's the place where God's presence dwells. It's the city for God's people. It is used negatively. That's why I was so surprised. I was preaching through Revelation a few weeks ago, and that was my surprise in Revelation, that it is used as a negative symbol, because it's almost always used as a positive symbol. Now, Jerusalem will rebel, God's people will rebel, but Jerusalem itself, when it's used as a city, is used as the city of God, the place that God's presence dwelt with His people, because the temple was there. Then there are some features of the Euphrates River. The Euphrates River is mentioned in Genesis 2, but it's also mentioned multiple times in Scripture, and it is the eastern boundary of the Promised Land. And so many times you'll hear a phrase like, as far east as the Euphrates, and that's to express God's abundance or God's provision for His people. And so there's an important symbol to recognize there, that Euphrates River is more than just a river. It represents that eastern boundary of what God had promised to give to His people. Then there's the Red Sea. Obviously, we've already mentioned the Red Sea, but the Red Sea is an important symbol in our minds. But the New Testament, in more than one place, uses it as a symbol for baptism. So you've been set free from your sin, and you're coming out, and you come through the waters, if you will. Now, I know that none of the Israelites got wet. The Egyptians did. You say, well, their baptism, that's a whole different symbol and story. But that symbol of them coming through the water is picked up as a symbol for baptism and also for new birth. Same thing with the Jordan River. We should think of the Jordan River as kind of a miniature Red Sea. When God is doing something great for His people, He'll part the Jordan River. And a lot of important things happen at the Jordan River. And in times past, people have connected that with death. Now, this is one of those moments where I can say this is where we want to be careful. The reason people will connect it with death is you cross the Jordan River to get into the Promised Land, right? And you enter the Promised Land, which you can make a good case that the Promised Land is somewhat representative of heaven. And so you can think of all the songs, that come to mind about crossing Jordan, meaning you're dying. That's one of those places where we've got to be really careful. I looked. There may be a place where I haven't seen it. I cannot find in Scripture where the Jordan River is compared to death, to entering into God's presence. And it wouldn't be compared in a negative way, but I couldn't find any place. What I could find, though, is a recreation of the Exodus. So this is a moment where God is saying, the same God that brought you out of Egypt, that brought you through the Red Sea, can part the Jordan and bring you through the Jordan. And so there's something there for us to think about with the Jordan River. Then there's Galilee and the Sea of Galilee. There's not a lot of symbolism here, but I do want to kind of reset our minds to recognize that most of Jesus' ministry took place in that region. So Jerusalem, yes, is the religious center of the Jewish people. And Jesus did ministry in Jerusalem, but mostly Jesus had controversy in Jerusalem. Most of His ministry was up in the Galilee region and around the Sea of Galilee. So we want to think about the importance of that. And it's important because Galilee, those are the country people up there. They can't know much about God. Those Galileans, remember, can anything good come out of Nazareth? I mean, they can't know anything up there. If you really want to know something about God, you got to get down here to Jerusalem. Well, the Messiah comes, and where does he do his ministry? He does it in Galilee. That's just the kind of thing that God would do. Then there's Mount Sinai. Mount Sinai is the place where God gives the covenant. It comes to represent, though, the covenant of the law. It's used a couple of times in the New Testament to represent the covenant of the law, and it's used in contrast with other mountains in that way. And then there's Mount Carmel. Mount Carmel is known as the Garden of God. It's used symbolically to represent beauty. It was apparently a very beautiful place, and so when Mount Carmel, for instance, in the prophets, when it is said to wither, that means God is judging His people. So not even Mount Carmel is blooming. The most beautiful place you can imagine, the Garden of God on top of a mountain, it's withering. So it's used in a prophetic way to say that God is, in that moment, removing His hand of blessing from His people. And of course, it's where Elijah confronted the prophets of Baal. Then there's the Valley of Jezreel. We know it most often as Megiddo or Armageddon, sometimes it's called. But it's a place of battle. Here's the interesting thing. It's a place of battle where Israel was often defeated. It's a big open plain. It's a perfect, battlefield for the ancient world, so a lot of battles were fought there. And when you start to read about Jezreel, you realize, yeah, there were some victories there, but there were also a lot of defeats there. It also represents a conflict between the people of God and those in rebellion against God. Then there are some people. There is Israel, and then the Jewish people, of course, that are part of Israel. These are physical descendants of Abraham, but not all descendants of Abraham. Only the descendants that come through Isaac and Jacob. And of course the 12 children that Isaac has and the 12 tribes that come out of that. Then there are Gentiles. Gentiles includes anybody else. Anybody who is not a descendant of Abraham through Isaac and Jacob, they are Gentiles. Spiritually speaking, the Jews can represent the people of God. Sometimes they can represent, and context will tell us this, sometimes they can represent organized religious opposition to God. Sometimes they represent the Jewish leaders. That phrase, the Jews, can actually just represent those Jewish leaders who refused to accept Jesus as Messiah. But then sometimes they represent the people of God in general. Whether you're Jew, Gentile, it doesn't matter your physical birth, you become part of Israel or you become part of the chosen people by placing your faith in the Lord. So the same thing is true with Gentiles. Sometimes Gentiles just means people who are not born to descendants of Abraham through Isaac and Jacob. But sometimes it means, there's a spiritual meaning to it. And so in the New Testament, context will tell you, it's the only way you can know. So you'll be reading along and you'll think, man, Paul is really saying some mean things about the Gentiles here. He's not actually meaning Gentiles, and the context makes it clear that he's talking about people who have rejected God or who have refused to accept God. So you could be a Jewish Gentile or you could be a Gentile Jew. It may take you some time to unpack that, but then there are proselytes and God-fearers. These are very important because these are non-Jewish people who to some degree have converted to Judaism. We'll go into more detail about that when we come to it. But these are very important in the early spread of the gospel. There are Canaanites. Canaanites is kind of a junk drawer term for anybody who lived in the land of Canaan. There are a bunch of ites underneath the Canaanites. And so we'll talk more about those when we come there. There are the Ishmaelites, who are separate from the Canaanites because those are people who descend from Ishmael. There are the Edomites. These are the people who descend from Esau. They are those who descend, instead of coming from Jacob and having 12 tribes, there's Esau. He grows into a great nation. If you've ever seen Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, where they go into the temple at the end and there's that great temple carved in the side of the stone. It's a city called Petra. From what I've heard, it actually doesn't go very far back into the rock at all. In Indiana Jones, it goes quite a bit back into the rock. They find the old knight back there, that whole thing. That's Petra. That was a city of the Edomites. So they were a very accomplished civilization. They descended from Esau. Then there are the Assyrians, or the Ninevites. These are the inhabitants of Assyria. They were very wicked. They're known both in Scripture and even historically outside of Scripture as being maybe the most wicked empire that happened to take over the ancient world. You should think of Assyrians and Mongols in kind of the same vein. That level of wickedness comes along with the Assyrians. So they conquered the northern kingdom and they scattered those tribes. Then there are the Babylonians or the Chaldeans. It's the same group of people. They inhabit the region of Babylon. They conquered the southern kingdom. They defeated the Assyrians, took over the known world, ended up conquering the southern kingdom, took them into exile. The Persians conquered Babylon. They say, we're moving too fast. We're going to come and unpack all of these, and we're going to see, here's what we'll see. We will see this. God used the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks, and the Romans to fulfill what Paul said, that at the right time God brought forth His Son, born of a woman, born under law. That verse is so pregnant with meaning. And we'll see the role that the Assyrians played. And if it hadn't been for the Assyrians, then this wouldn't have been ready. If it hadn't been for the Babylonians coming along after them, we wouldn't have had this. Had it not been for the Persians, we would have missed this. Had it not been for the Greeks and the Romans, every one of them played a part in preparing the first century for the coming of the Messiah and the spread of the gospel. So we'll be very excited to unpack that. And then, of course, there are the Greeks and the Romans. One thing about the Greeks, and we'll unpack it again when we get there, is in the New Testament, Greek culture is still very dominant. Romans did not replace Greek culture. They adopted Greek culture. They were very smart. Why change the culture of the people? Just bring it on into our culture. And because of that, Greek culture still dominates. And the New Testament makes a distinction between the Greeks and the Jews. The Jews seek for signs. The Greeks look for wisdom. And so when you're sharing the gospel with a Greek, then you need to come at it from one approach. When you're sharing the gospel with a Jew, you need to come at it from a different approach. As Paul unpacks in the New Testament. A few other elements, things I couldn't really find a way to classify. We have the covenants. There are several covenants in Scripture. We're going to hit on these that are fairly agreed upon as actual covenants, the Noahic, the Abrahamic, the Mosaic, the Davidic covenant, and the New Covenant. Then there's the tabernacle and the temple. The tabernacle and the temple those are the places where God's presence on earth dwells among His people. There's so much symbolism there, so much beauty there that we miss because we don't interact with the temple and the tabernacle very much. The tabernacle is a portable version of the temple. Once the temple is built, the tabernacle is no more, but they're the same. They function the same way for God's people. There's the diaspora or the dispersion, and those are God's people that are spread out all over the known world, and that has a significant spiritual application. It represents really us. We are part of the dispersion. We're not Jewish, but we've been spread out in a place that's not our home. So we're separated from our homeland, and the New Testament picks up that imagery as well. And then there's the exile. The exile refers to the deportation of the Jews to Babylon. But here's the important thing about the exile. As the New Testament opens, both through the prophets and through the early writings of the New Testament, those first few books of the New Testament, it is clear that the Jewish people do not believe they have really returned from exile. And that's so important. Okay, the Persians let them come back, rebuild the temple, rebuild the city. But there's this longing, this feeling. This is not the restoration that God promised us. God promised us a restoration, and this is not it. And so there's this feeling that they've not really returned from exile. What that does is it sets the stage for the Messiah, not only to be the one who brings them out of Egypt and brings them into the Promised Land, but also the one who brings them ultimately out of exile. So all of these symbols are right there. They're in the pages of the New Testament. And when we get there, I'll show them to you so that you don't say, well, you're just making these things up. I didn't make any of this up. These are all things that have been taught to me and that I've seen, people have pointed out to me in Scripture, and I want to share them with you so that when you're reading the New Testament, you actually see these themes borne out for you, even in the epistles. They're there, but if you don't see them, you'll never see them. But once you see them, you go, my goodness, that was there all along. So very excited about our study through this, and I'm excited to dive in next week. Next session, we will dive into this idea of regions and nations.